Hello, Dr. Fraser.
Hello. Yes, I can hear you well. Says Daniel, is that correct?
Yes, I'm Daniel. I think you've been speaking with Dr. Cho.
That's right, yes.
I'll be moderating today.
Okay.
So we get started in a bit, shortly after 4 p.m. our time here, and
right.
I'll introduce you and do all the preliminaries, and then I'll let you share your screen, and then you could take it from there.
Right. Hopefully the screen share will go easily. I've just got a PowerPoint that I'll bring up on my computer, I guess, and go from there.
Yeah, sure, yeah. You can, at the bottom, there's a share screen button in the Zoom. You can just click that and then.
Right.
Yeah, but for now, I'll share something from my screen here.
Hi, Dr. Fraser. This is George.
Oh, hello, George.
What's keeping you busy?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
What's keeping you busy?
Oh, well, I've had a little bit of work and a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle that my wife has gotten into. You can waste such a lot of time with those things, but they're quite fun for a little relaxation.
I guess things at Loma Linda are kind of, it's not functioning right now, right? Loma Linda shut down?
No, it's shut down substantially for non-emergency kind of things. But I'm a cardiologist, and we're still doing quite a lot of testing and just starting to relax a little bit.
And are there COVID patients that you're seeing there as well?
I haven't seen any, but they don't usually end up on the cardiology ward. But yeah, there are a few that have come through the hospital. In San Bernardino County, which is where we are, it's not been very high. In fact, California, as you probably know, is about only 1/10 as high as many of the northeastern states. Where are you at now?
Toronto, Canada.
Toronto. I see. How is it there?
I don't know. How much infections there do we have? 60,000, I think.
60,000. Well, that's a good number. Yeah.
And the university is probably not functioning, I suppose, right now.
No, the university is not. I think they've had a lot of online classes. They may have finished. I'm not absolutely sure.
Right.
All right, well, we're going to get started shortly. Just want to welcome everyone who's joined us. We're also live streaming this, so for anyone who's watching on the live stream, we want to thank you. Let's just wait maybe a minute or two more as people trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much. In the meantime, if you want, you can put in the chat, just say hi and maybe share where you're from, just to see the kind of group that we have today. Thanks so much. right. All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. So I just want to thank you all for joining us today for the webinar. For those who are watching on our Facebook live stream, I want to welcome you too. Thank you so much for sharing part of your Sunday, your Mother's Day Sunday with us. And if any of you on the line are mothers, we want to wish you a wonderful Mother's Day. Just want to say a few things before we get started here. Just note that this session is being recorded and also live streamed. So I think we have everyone on mute, but if you are not muted, we encourage you to do so. And you could put on your video, but just know again that we are live streaming. Also, we will be taking questions as well at the end of the main presentation by Dr. Fraser. So if you have a question, you can just put them in the chat box as the presentation goes on, and we'll try to address as many as possible at the end. Also, if you want to ask your question verbally, you can do so. You just click the raise your hand function, and then we'll try to unmute you so then you could ask your questions verbally. And of course, the sessions that we do are for educational purposes only. Please speak with your healthcare provider before applying any of the information that is shared during the session. So my name is Daniel, and I'm from an organization called Lifestyle is Medicine, which is the main organizer for this event. Lifestyle is Medicine is a not-for-profit based in Toronto that provides lifestyle medicine programming in the community. This event is also being put on with Pathways Lifestyle Medicine Clinics in Toronto, which is our clinic partner, and also the Western Toronto Korean Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we'll be learning a lot about Adventists today. They are recognized as one of the healthiest and longest living people groups in America and the world. And I'm just going to give a moment to Pastor Travis Kwon, who's the pastor there, who's going to just share a brief welcome. So Pastor Kwon, you there?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. It's good to see you at this health event. We're proud to sponsor this webinar. And thank you, Dr. George, for hosting this amazing opportunity. And especially thank you, Dr. Gary, for your upcoming presentation today. Our church, Seventh Adventist Church, believes that a sound and meaningful life comes from a healthy lifestyle. And a healthy body is deeply related to our spirituality, relationship with God especially. That's why the Seventh Adventist Church has been trying hard to spread health message to the community. I hope that you can learn something beneficial for your body and soul. So enjoy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Pastor Travis. We are just really pleased to have a very distinguished speaker today. Let me just take a few moments to introduce him. His name is Dr. Gary Fraser. He's a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Loma Linda University in California and a principal investigator of the famous Adventist Health Studies. The Adventist Health Studies is a very well-known series of long-term research projects out of Loma Linda. And basically it's comparing health behaviors among Seventh-day Adventists. And let's look at their lifestyle, their disease, and their diet and disease and mortality outcomes. And they've really found some fascinating findings about the health benefits of various lifestyle patterns, such as plant-based eating and other lifestyle behaviors. So we just really pleased to have Dr. Fraser with us. I believe, Dr. Fraser, you've published, I think, like many papers in peer-reviewed journals. And Dr. Fraser, before I turn it over to you, I just want to just say that, back in 2007, when I was an undergrad in university, I embarked on a study of plant-based nutrition. I was in the lab of Dr. David Jenkins, which I think you may know.
Yes,
Yes, and I was volunteering in his lab, and he gave me one of your books. I think it's called Chronic Disease, Diet, Lifestyle, and Chronic Disease, or something like that, or Life Expectancy. And so I went on PubMed, and I literally searched your name and read a whole bunch of your papers on the Adventist Health studies. So you've made a really big impact on my own journey in plant-based nutrition, and I'm just really honored to connect with you by this means, and to have you present for us today. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. So we're going to try and share screen here. Let's see how that goes. It says here that I cannot do it while you are sharing at the same time. Right, hopefully, let's try again. Okay.
Yes.
So you can see that?
Yes, you can just play your PowerPoint, and then we'll be good to go.
Right. Well, guess what? I've got, there we go, I think. All right, these electronic things, they always have some last minute minor hitches, but I think we're getting slowly better at this. So thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. And you can probably tell that I'm not from Canada or from the United States, actually, and a little bit of my homeland is behind me from New Zealand. But I've been living here in California for a long time, where Loma Linda University is. So I'd like to talk about, that's interesting, we're the very last slide here, and I don't seem to be able to control that. So let me go this way. There we go. So I've entitled my talk, Living Longer and Living Better, the Adventist Health Studies that actually started federally funded studies about 60 years ago. So there's some of the very longest federally funded studies that exist. And a little bit of history, I'm an epidemiologist, and so I'm going to show you quite a few slides, probably too many for some of you, but I believe in sharing the evidence, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. And hopefully we'll get time for some questions and that. In fact, I'll make sure of that. I believe I've got about 30 minutes or so I'll try and keep to something like that. So let me tell you how, as scientists, we work. First of all, it's something which a lot of people don't realize, that there are few, if any, absolutes in science. We tend to start with an idea that we think is a good idea and perhaps has some support from some level of evidence, often a bit scanty, and we want to build around it and see if the further evidence tends to support it further or whether it tends to reject it, adding evidence to enhance it or to reduce its credibility. So Adventists had a long history, of course, of a story that really came from the 19th century, pre-scientific times substantially. And the idea was that a plant-based diet was more healthful. And then by the 1950s, I would say, when epidemiology as a science was really just getting going, at least chronic disease epidemiology, the idea of a plant-based diet being a good diet to have, being more healthful, did have a certain appeal even in more scientific circles. And one could make a case for it based on some things we knew about nutritional science, about pathology, and about some of the other mechanisms, biological mechanisms. And at that time, some of my predecessors here back in 1958 realized that Adventists had something rather special that they could offer in this regard. First of all, Adventists don't smoke, and small amounts only of alcohol are consumed by a few. And these are kind of what we call confounding factors in many of these problems. So we were going to be focused, and we are going to be today, very focused on nutrition. And that's not to say that I believe that nutrition is all there is to healthful living. Absolutely not. But I do believe it's an important part, and it happens to be the focus that I've had in my career to a large extent. So Adventists didn't have some of these confusing factors that can, what we call, confound the evidence, like alcohol and smoking. They also were very useful potentially in having a very wide range of dietary habit, because it turned out that Adventists are not mandated to be vegetarians, it's just recommended. And only about half of Adventists in the United States follow that recommendation. So we had people who were vegans, no animal products, lacto-ovo vegetarians, but we also had non-vegetarians. We had Adventists who ate somewhat like the rest of the population. So we could ask very strong questions with big contrast between the way that people ate, and see how this played out in their health experience as we followed them along. So we felt it was very important that we had a population that include both traditional US dietary habits, but also some atypical choices, because if we only had a population that ate in traditional ways, we could only test the effect of traditional diets. In this sense, to have a partly atypical character to the population is a real advantage if we want to explore more innovative dietary questions. Questions and habits that nevertheless could fairly readily be chosen by many non-Adventists, not too extreme. And it turns out that we're going to largely talk today about results from a study that we have called Adventist Health Study 2, or AHS2, which is the largest study of vegetarians and vegans in the world, as it turns out. Another quite large study in that similar way is out of Oxford in England, actually, and we've collaborated with them. So a couple of observations. We know that the US population consists of Adventists and non-Adventists. Now that might be kind of a strange way to divide the population, but just for our present purpose today, it makes some sense. And so our story would predict that the Adventists have a lower rate of many common diseases and perhaps greater life expectancy, because many of them follow a plant-based diet, and our story suggests that that's healthful. So let's check it out. So the first question is, considering this as a natural experiment, let's investigate comparisons of disease rates and mortality rates between Adventists and others. Thinking about life expectancy, and Daniel already mentioned something about some of these results. And this is actually from a slightly older study of about 34,000 California Adventists, and we were able to compare their life expectancy to other Californians at that same point in time. And you can see here, if I use my cursor, that the Adventist men were experiencing about a 7.3 year longer life expectancy. Their average age at death was 7.3 years older than their non-Adventist Californian neighbors. And if we looked at the woman, they were experiencing about an extra 4.5 years approximately. And these were based on thousands of deaths, and they were not due to random factors. They were obviously very real. For those of you who are statisticians, the p-values were 0.000, you know. If we looked at the vegetarians amongst our population, remember only about half of our population were vegetarian, those numbers, the advantage experienced by the Adventist increased to 9.5 years in men and just over 6 years in women. So big differences. Thinking about this in a different way, the percentage of the population who survived to age 85 years or older, and here's different countries here from, this was the mid to late 80s. In the United States at that time, about 20% of men were surviving to that age or older, and nearly double that, about 40% of women. But the Adventist California men, about twice as many of them were surviving to that age. And if they were vegetarians, nearly 2.5 times, nearly half of them were surviving to that age. And the woman, 40% of the non-Adventists, 54% of the Adventists, and if they were vegetarian, about 60%. So this is interesting stuff. And without dwelling on this, this is what we call a survival curve. This is where everybody is alive at the age of 30 years here. Let's follow through the proportion who are still surviving at different ages. And this is the Californian non-Adventist population. And you can see at different ages, fewer and fewer surviving. By the time you get down to 100, there's virtually at a 0 over here. And this is the curve for the Adventists in California. And this is the men, actually. And you can see that they are surviving longer. There's a greater proportion alive at any particular age that you choose. And the area here actually represents the portion or the number of additional years experienced by the whole Adventist population. Now you might say, well, okay, that's interesting. I wonder what Adventists die of. And without taking a lot of time here, it turns out that all Californians, non-Adventists, about nearly 40% die of heart disease. Adventists about the same proportion. If you look at cancers, 23% of Californians, somewhat fewer of Adventists, and you find the same kind of thing for most of these, that the proportion of people who are dying of different causes are very similar comparing the Californians to the Adventists. What's different is the age at which these deaths are occurring. And you can see that here. And there's this is for men, this kind of 7-year difference. And it's almost across the board. Whatever you're dying from, the Adventists were experiencing about a 7-year increase in life expectancy in the men. A similar table for women shows about 4. So this is a much more recent study in our large recent population, the HS2, that's 96,000 Adventists from all over California. So we were able to compare mortality rates in our Adventists as compared to a US Census population. Important thing to realize, ooh, my computer is doing crazy things here. Let me bring that back on. The important thing to realize is that this line here, it represents the US Census population. So this is the experience that we give a score of 1 to the non-Adventists, US Adventists. This is a national population of Adventists here. And you can see if we look at mortality from all causes, at age 65, there's about a 30%, 35% reduction, a little less if you take people who have survived to 85 years. If you look at Black Adventists compared to Black non-Adventists, there's also about this 35% reduction in mortality. People who died of cancer, the Adventists were at lower cancer risk as compared to the non-Adventists, and so on. Other causes of death, at 2 different people who survived to 85, and Black Adventists. So again, this is consistent data to what we saw with life expectancy, but from a much larger study, Adventists across the whole country compared to a US Census population. So if we look at causes of death, and this is a study of all Californian Adventists in our study as compared to non-Adventists in a study of non-Adventists from North and Central California that used the same definitions and criteria for diagnosing heart disease. And you can see at different ages, these curves here represent the Adventist experience. These are the men and these are the women, the Adventists. And you can see they hang well below the frequency of heart attack that was seen in the non-Adventist population, particularly in the younger and middle-aged people. So we're saving particularly premature deaths from heart disease. If we look at cancer, or now we're back to our census population again, our national population, and we were able to look at causes of death. And whether we look at all cancer, where we see the Adventist group as compared to the non-Adventists, which get the score of 1, that the Adventists are having again about that 30-35% protection from cancer this time. Previously, it was all causes of mortality. This is not fatal cancers, this is all cancers. people who die and people who survive. And if we look at different types of cancer, breast cancer in all subjects and in Black subjects, again, without taking time to go through this, different sites in the body of different cancers, these black spots nearly always hang to the left of this line that represents the non-Adventist experience with these cancers. How about quality of life? It's not much good living longer if you're not having a good quality of life during those extra years. Well, this is based on something called the SF-12, which is a fairly standard set of questions to look at quality of life. And this is physical quality of life, and down below is mental quality of life. And this is the women, this is the men. The dark, the heavier black line is US norms across the whole population. The other two lines here are black woman Adventists and non-black female Adventists. And you can see at every age here, this is age going from left to right down here, that the quality of life is higher in the Adventists than the US norms. Here this is physical health, remember, and this is the men over here. They're higher than the US norms. If we turn to mental health, and interestingly, that gets a little higher with age, whereas physical health gets a little lower. But again, we see the Adventist black and white hanging above the US norm. So it appears that not only are the Adventists living longer, they have this dramatic extension in life expectancy as well. And it seems that the main effect seems to be a later age of death from whatever the cause. Could there be some impact on a basic rate of cellular aging? What else would affect all causes of death? Also much reduced rates of cancer and heart disease in both black and white Adventists. So in this kind of natural experiment, we did find a result that seemed to boost our story. It was somewhat as we'd predicted. The Adventists do much better. And by the way, we did adjust usually for educational differences and differences in smoking history, seeing there were some Adventists who had been past smokers before they became Adventists. So what would the next question in our journey be? So what could it be as far as the health that so favors Adventists? And one could think of religiosity, trust in God, and different ways of measuring religiosity. Could be the plant-based diet that we talked about, or some other Adventist aspect of healthy Adventist living. And of course, other groups have some of these individual elements, but not often are they found all together. So first of all, let's just look at a couple of things about religiosity. And we did measure in about 11,000 of our subjects, just standard scales of religiosity. And I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but you can get a sense of what they measured. A positive or negative relationship with God. When you're in trouble, who do you turn to for support? Do you get a lot of support from your religion, your relationship with God? And these are depression scores down here. And you can see that where the relationship with God is good, this has got a negative in front of it, which means less depression. Where you get more religious support, less depression. But if you view God as some kind of an ogre, someone to be feared, a negative religious functioning factor, then you have more depression. It's got a positive score. So remember, these are all Adventists. And going across here, and again, I don't have time to go through it. If you look at satisfaction with life, we find that the relationship with God factor, and when it's higher, this is higher as well. When religious support is higher, this is higher as well. When negative religious functioning is higher, that's a worse situation. Satisfaction gets a negative score, less satisfaction. So there's something going on here that relates to this. I think I'm going to pass by this in relation because of time. So without going into a lot of detail on this, maybe some of you will have questions later. We did find that positive spirituality appears to be a strong promoter of fewer depressive thoughts and attitude and greater resilience to deal with adverse experiences. However, we found little evidence that religiosity per se in itself directly influenced physical health. But in an indirect way, it obviously did, because the more involved Adventists, because of the health emphasis in their religious affiliation, were people that were more interested in personal health. They were better educated about lifestyle. They had better support from their family, from their friends in maintaining good health habits. And these health habits did affect physical health. So indirectly, the Adventist religious affiliation was also responsible for better physical health. Let me turn now to the plant-based diet as a possible explanation for the better experience, health experience of Adventists. This is an obvious and major special characteristic of Adventists. About half of them, remember, are vegetarian, and it's not mandated, as I said, but we could compare different kinds of people. But you must bear in mind that our non-vegetarian Adventists on average were low meat, only about 3 ounces a day, the total of red and white meat. So a focus comparing one kind of Adventist, the vegetarian, to our meat-eating Adventists is actually still a hard comparison. The difference in this particular food is not very, very great. And yet, nevertheless, we do find differences, as I'm going to show you now, between different kinds of Adventists, those that are vegetarian and those that are meat eaters. How much more impressive would this look probably if we had comparisons with regular meat eaters? In our population, our study population in HS2, we had about 9,000 vegans, had about 30,000 lacto-ovo vegetarians. We had some that were only fish eaters, nearly 10,000. Down the bottom, about 42,000 who were our meat eaters, but on average, relatively low meat eaters, at least once a week or more. Just a couple of slides here now that look at some of the biological factors. In other words, not based on questionnaire evidence, but are there things about the bodies and the makeup of the bodies and some of the concentrations of chemicals in our blood or in our tissues that discriminate between Adventists of different sorts, people that have different diets. You can see we've got the vegans who are green through to the omnivores, the meat eaters who are red, and the lacto-ovo who are yellow, and so forth. And if we look at the carotenoids in the blood, and these are generally colorful chemicals that are a pretty good indication of consumption of fruit and vegetables, you can see that the vegans have higher levels and the meat eaters tend to have lower levels. If we look at the isoflavones, these are chemicals, phytoestrogens, plant-based estrogens, weak estrogens that are found particularly in soy products. And there again, you find the vegans have much higher levels actually in their overnight urine excretion here, and the meat-eating Adventists have much lower levels. Enterolactone, that's another weak estrogen, plant-based, and again, we find the same gradient. And this 1-methylhistidine is something that's found in animal muscle. So this is an indication of how well were we actually managing to identify the vegans as compared to the non-vegetarians. And you can see that we really were doing a pretty good job. These were the meat eaters, these were the partial meat eaters, these were the fish eaters, and these were the vegetarians that had hardly any of this animal-derived amino acid. We also took little nubbins of fat from under the skin of about 1,000 of our people. They were very forgiving people, you know, we stuck needles into them and sucked it out, and they let us do it, you know. And we found that when we looked at omega-3 fatty acids, again, we found a gradation that was too strong to be chance. Other factors, we looked at C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation. We found that the non-vegetarians had higher levels in their blood. We looked at fasting insulin, and again, we found that gradation. The non-vegetarians had higher fasting insulin. Diabetics tend to have high insulin levels. When we looked at different fatty acids under the skin, I won't take time to go through this, but again, we found differences. So it was clear that what people were eating were affecting the way their bodies were made up, the chemicals in their bodies. Now, turning to some of the risk factors that we're all familiar with. And again, from vegans through to non-vegetarians, who are sometimes blue here, unfortunately, but we see body weight, big differences. That women average 5'4" tall, men 5'10", that as you took people of the same height and looked at their average body weight, there were big differences between the vegans and the non-vegetarians. When you looked at the amount of the proportion who were diabetic, we also found it just kind of went up like a stepladder. Those who were currently under treatment for high blood pressure, also big differences. Under treatment for high blood cholesterol, big differences. And so we seem to be seeing some important and interesting things when we compare people who eat a plant-based diet compared to those who do not, all of these being Adventists. So what about the frequency of disease in these groups? If we look at total mortality, here are the vegetarian and here are the non-vegetarians. And again, not huge, but we are finding significant differences in the rates of mortality within the Adventist group now. Remember, I was showing you before comparing all Adventists to all non-Adventists, but even within the Adventist group, and this rather hard comparison between these meat eaters who really weren't eating a whole lot of meat and the vegetarians were still finding a difference. If we look at mortality from heart disease, again, we see the same kind of trends and patterns. If we look at the probability of surviving one's whole life free of colon cancer, here's the vegetarians here. There's always a higher proportion. These are all Adventists, remember, and these are the Adventist non-vegetarians who are surviving less free of colon cancer. If we look at the rate of new prostate cancer, again, we find not a lot of difference between the lacto-ovo-vegetarians and the pesco-vegetarians and the non-vegetarians. They're kind of wobbling around a little bit, but that's easily compatible with chance. But what we did find is that the vegans had significantly less, about 34% less prostate cancer as compared to the non-vegetarians. If we look at the probability of surviving free of breast cancer in the vegans and the non-vegetarians and the pescos, you can see again, it's the vegans that seem to stand out. They're surviving longer, or put it another way, at any particular age, those free of breast cancer are greater proportion than the other groups. So both the prostate and the breast, the vegans seem to stand out, whereas all of the vegetarians seem to do better for colon cancer. So in this part of our natural experiment, comparing vegetarians versus non-vegetarians, so digging just that little bit deeper, we found kind of what we'd predicted, that the vegetarian Adventists were usually doing better than the non-vegetarians. So surely this explains at least an important part of the Adventist Health advantage. So the third and final part that I want to talk about today is what could it be about the vegetarian diets that are so helpful? Is it a small number of key foods or nutrients? Or is it many, many items that each have very small but additive impact? So I've guessed in part that it's the former, that there are a few particularly influential foods, but it's a tough call to separate those out from the hundreds of other foods and nutrients that we eat. And I'm just going to focus on, and for good reasons, biological reasons, on nuts, red meats, and dairy, and I'm probably not going to say much about tomatoes with the time I've got. So here's a study we did and published, and we were looking at the amount of protein that different people got from meats. And we found at the younger ages, 25 to 44, and this is looking at total mortality, the risk of total mortality, that as the proportion of meats went up and the those actually, there's a spot missing here that's right on the line. They're the lowest fifth of the population. And you can see that as there's more and more meat consumption, but particularly up in the highest level, the risk of mortality, this is actually mortality from heart disease, cardiovascular mortality, goes up. Higher meat consumption. At middle-aged people, same kind of trend, perhaps only a 50% increase here. It was about double risk here in the high meat consumers. And interestingly, by the time you get over the age of 65, and particularly over 85, that signal kind of dies away. If we look at the protein from nut consumption, we find exactly the opposite. And this is adjusting for a whole bunch of other things. We find that the high nut consumers, and there's a spot missing right here, that is the lowest fifth of nut consumers, that those high nut consumers are less than half the risk of dying from heart disease, cardiovascular mortality. The same for the middle-aged people. And again, the signal kind of weakens and dies in the very old. Turning now to from cardiovascular disease to colorectal cancer, and looking at this time processed red meat. Before we were looking at meat protein and nut protein, now processed red meat. And one sausage a day is at about 50 grams a day. And you can see here that as compared to those who eat no processed red meat, those who are eating the sausage a day have about a 60% increased risk of colorectal cancer in our data. Now, I just want to finish up with a few slides that relate to dairy. And if you look down here, this is to do with colorectal cancer and colon cancer, large bowel. And those who ate more or ate and drank more dairy products in our population, remember these are all Adventists, we give those who had very little, in fact, these were mainly zero dairy consumers, we give them a score of 1. The higher dairy consumers had about 1/3 less of colorectal cancer, or colon cancer in this case, and about the same for colorectal cancer. So it appeared there that dairy milk had a somewhat protective effect on colorectal cancer. And we dug a little deeper and said, okay, well, let's look within the dairy consumers, and maybe it's the calcium that's the cause of this, because dairy, of course, is a good source of calcium. And indeed, that seemed to be the case, that when we just focused on the calcium, we found a very strong signal for those who got a lot of calcium from their dairy. And this is even adjusting for other facets of dairy consumption. But if we look at other cancers, the picture changes. This is unpublished work as yet, but it's consistent with a number of other studies. If we give people who are the zero dairy consumers a score of 1.0, then those who are at the high end of dairy consumption in the upper fifth, they're experiencing about a 35 to 40% increased risk of prostate cancer. And that's true of advanced cancer as well as the non-advanced. This is unlikely to be due to chance for those of you who understand p-values. So here it seems like the dairy is not a good thing. If we look at breast cancer, there's some interest in soy as being protective. We didn't find that in our data so long as we adjusted for dairy, and people in our population tended to swap soy for dairy backwards and forwards. And when we looked at the consumption of milk particularly, we found that higher milk consumers as compared to zero milk consumers had again a 35 to 40% increased risk of breast cancer. And if we modeled what would happen if people swapped, say, 2/3 of a cup of dairy milk for soy milk, they would get a 35 to 45% reduction in breast cancer was what our model suggested. And just to make this graphically, it seems like at even rather low amounts of dairy, we were seeing an upward slope in our risk of breast cancer here, as indicated by this line, as compared to those who use no dairy milk at all. So once again, certain predictions have come to pass. And we recognize that there's a great deal we don't understand yet about plant-based as compared to animal food diets. But it does appear that there are some probably influential foods, perhaps in a background of many other small advantageous effects. So our story is intact and indeed looks stronger. Compared to non-Adventists, Adventists are on average at much lower risk of many chronic diseases. And within the Adventist population, those that subscribe to various variants of plant-based diets seem to do better. And as we've just seen, there's various foods that seem to be perhaps some of the important factors concerned. And one can even think of some cellular and biochemical mechanisms, also maybe effects on obesity that may provide plausible explanations. So it seems to me in conclusion that health benefits both personally and also for the planet, and I haven't talked about that, should be strong motivation, or could be for many rational people to pursue dietary change in a plant-based direction. In modern parlance, the advantages of a plant-based diet, it appears, are not fake news, but are actually the real deal. So let me stop there.
All right. All right, thank you, Dr. Fraser. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, yes. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, so we're gonna jump into Q&A. Dr. Fraser, we've been having some very perceptive questions come in. So we're gonna just take them one by one. And for those who, if you have a question, please do throw them into the Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And if you're on Facebook as well, we're monitoring Facebook. So just put your question in as a comment, and we'll try to get to those as well. So Dr. Fraser, our first question here is about the racial difference. Is there a reason why Black population has a higher prostate cancer rate than the rest of the non-Adventist population?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, the person who asked this may know that we are not unusual in that respect, that for reasons that are actually pretty much still unclear, Blacks in general, US Blacks in general, and also I think from the Caribbean, have about twice the rate of prostate cancer as non-Blacks. Asians in Asia tend to be relatively protected. It's not clear that Blacks in Africa, at least rural Africa, have the same experience. So whether it's lifestyle or not is unclear. We've looked carefully at many, many different dietary factors, and we could not find an explanation. Many others have done the same thing as well. So whether this might be one of the very few genetic issues that separate the races, there are very, very few of those, but it's possible, or whether there's some other environmental influence that we haven't looked at, we simply don't know.
Okay.
But I guess one conclusion that one can draw from that is that Black men are going to be wise to be very careful in terms of taking preventive actions and screening for prostate cancer as they get a little older.
Maybe follow some of the things that you share with us today. Dr. Fraser, another question here. Among the vegetarian Adventists, how come some do live to 100, like as featured in the blue zones, while others don't? They usually live into their 80s, I think you said. So why is it some people do live up to 100? Like, why is that?
Yeah, well, you know, we have not really focused on the centenarians. Some people have, and we've we've gotten this reputation for being one of the blue zones, and some of you may have read an article in the National Geographic back in 2005, and then it was somewhat repeated again in January of this year. But a lot of these, or a number of these other populations, have focused on people who lived over 100. We've focused on the whole population. And what we've seen is that on average, people are living those 7 years longer, or if you're vegetarians, 9 years longer for the men, and a few years less longer for the woman. So yeah, we have some of our Adventists who, of course, live to over 100, and it's pretty clear that there are major genetic differences that are very influential when it comes to how long you're going to live. But what you can say is that whatever the genetics that you inherit from your parents, the way you live your life acts on top of that. So even though those Adventists who are a little unlucky perhaps and die in their late 70s or 80s, on average, they almost certainly would have died even a good deal younger if they hadn't have lived their life carefully. Those that live to over 100, the same is probably true, that they may not have lived that old if they hadn't been somewhat careful. But, some people are just genetically well endowed, and you get the occasional person that everybody remembers, of course, who smoked all his life and has done all kinds of other things, never exercised a day in his life, and lives to the age of 98. But I can tell you that's a rare person. There's the people that everyone remembers. They don't comment on the ones who did all those things and died at the age of 50.
True. Thank you. We have a question here, a great question from CS. Thank you, CS, for joining us. I would like to know the definition of the non-vegan diets. For example, what percentage of animal products were they comprised of?
Yeah, our definitions, and I'm not sure exactly in what form you want these definitions, but they were as follows. A non-vegetarian, let me start at that end, had to eat the total of meats, and including some red and white meats, at least once a week. The semi-vegetarians had to eat some of these meats, and not only fish, more than once a month, but less than once a week. So they were the semi-vegetarians. The pesco-vegetarians were people that the only flesh food they ate was fish, and it had to be at least once a month. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians were people that did consume dairy or eggs, but flesh foods either not at all or at least less than once a month. The vegans were people who ate no animal products at all, at least not with a frequency of more than once a month.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. Hope that answers your question. I skipped a few questions here. One question is, why do Adventists promote a vegetarian eating?
Yeah. Well, of course, there are historical reasons, and I started by saying that we had a story. And if you go way back into the 19th century, as many of you will know, one of the founders of our church was someone called Ellen White, who was a prolific author. And she was given to believe that health was a very important part of religion, that Adventists have always been creationists. We believe in a created God. We believe in respecting the bodies that were created for us, and that this is part of a good religion. And the reason that primarily historically Adventists have advocated a plant-based diet is for the health effects. There were perhaps less clear indications that it may have useful implications for mental health and even for religiosity, but that's less clear. It was mainly for the the physical health effects, is my understanding.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Fraser. We have I think someone's line has some feedback. If you're if you can mute us, if you're not speaking, that'd be great. Dr. Fraser, we have some question about the younger Adventists. So so we see these effects on, but I'm gonna just combine some questions here. They're asking, do you think that the younger generation of Adventists are also gonna have these longevity benefits that you've researched, and not relate to that? These new plant-based meat alternatives are becoming more popular among the new generation. The questioner asks, younger Adventists are eating more of these, and what are your thoughts on these and the potential implication for their health as well? So,
well, it's an interesting question, and you may have noticed it kind of came up once or twice in the slides I showed you that some of these impacts of diet seem to be especially manifested, proportionate-wise at least, in younger and middle-aged people. And the impact of a good diet by the time you've reached 70 and 80 years of life tends to be much less. And so healthful living, at least in this respect, seems to particularly save those years of life that people might lose in premature deaths when they happen at younger and middle ages. So that's one part of an answer that I might give. The other part is interesting also, and that relates to these newer foods that are coming on the market. We're right now actually in the middle of an analysis. It's unpublished as yet, and some other researchers have also published a little bit, where we've compared foods not so much as to whether they are animal or plant, but whether they are highly processed or not. And a lot of these newer products, of course, are fairly highly processed. And what we're finding is that the processed, non-processed spectrum seems to have a significant impact on mortality, where less processed foods are associated with lesser disease or particularly mortality. And it seems to be kind of an independent thing as compared to the plant-animal spectrum. And so the two things kind of add together. And so I think it's a good question as to whether people who eat largely of these processed but plant foods are going to get the same advantage as compared to more natural plant-based foods. We don't know is the answer yet. As we go forward and hopefully get involved in further studies, we are actually capturing that level of information.
That's wonderful. We're looking forward to when those studies come out. That's fascinating. Dr. Fraser, we have a question about the blue zone. So the question is saying that some of the blue zones like Okinawa are expected to basically lose their longevity, kind of the benefits because of the westernization of the diet and this sort of thing. The question is, does Dr. Fraser expect the Loma Linda blue zone to stay strong, or could it go the way of the Okinawa blue zone? So what are your thoughts? I believe you live in Loma Linda. Am I not? Is that correct?
Very close.
Close.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So what are you seeing there?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the Loma Linda blue zone is a bit of a misnomer. People who invented the blue zone, they tied it to a relatively small geographic area. The data on which the quotes Loma Linda blue zone was based was run from a study at Loma Linda, but it involved people from all over the state of California. So there's nothing particularly special about Loma Linda, although there is some concentration of Adventists who live there. So I think the broader question is, do we expect younger generations of Adventists to still live by the health principles that have historically been observed. And, you know, I'm hopeful about that. There are all kinds of generational influences, and what we typically find, and I think in almost all generations, that younger people are less concerned about their health and the way they live their life, although there's a great deal of variability in that. But, you know, when you start to get into your 40s and 50s and a few more aches and pains, and someone you know has developed cancer and someone else has had a heart attack, you start to take your own mortality a little bit more seriously. And, you know, from what I've seen, it's a bit of a pity to wait that long, because you've lost some of the benefit already, but probably it's still worthwhile making changes at that time. And so, you know, I'm very hopeful that our younger people, even though, you know, there'll be a lot of variation now, that they'll follow in pretty much the same path as those of us who are a little older.
Okay, wonderful. Our time is basically up. I'm going to throw one last question here. Dr. Fraser, it's about epidemiological studies. And the question is, some criticize epidemiological studies as not being able to establish causation. Thereby, they criticize those who promote plant-based nutrition for having weak evidence, since a lot of the data comes from epidemiological data. Dr. Fraser, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that also is a question I'm pleased that came up, because it is true that technically speaking, an observational study such as ours, which was not an experiment, cannot with certainty talk about cause and effect. However, to be fair, there are no studies that can. Even randomized trials have substantial weaknesses, and unfortunately a randomized trial is just not simply possible in this kind of thing, where, for instance, talking about cancer, they take decades to develop. You cannot assign some group of people randomly to become vegetarians and another group to be non-vegetarians for the next 20 years. It can't be done. So what you've got to do is to build the evidence. And that's what I tried to do a little bit today, that you started to see consistency at different levels as you built that evidence. The next big level that we've got to focus on is the biology and the mechanisms inside the body. But I also showed you a little bit along those directions as well, because we're seeing that the vegans in their blood levels and in the levels of different chemicals, even in their adipose tissue, they're different, and they're different in ways that we think will make a positive difference. But that's a good question, but just be aware of the fact that causality is never established with certainty. What you do is you build the evidence. And I would say that the evidence now, although less than certain, is strong enough for a prudent person to take some action.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Fraser, so much for joining us today and sharing your research with us. We really appreciate it. I just want to thank everyone else for joining us. Our time is up. Before I let you go, I just want to invite you to our next Lifestyle Med live event. It's this Thursday at 7 o'clock. We'll be joined by Dr. Joyce Che, who's a medical doctor, and she's going to share her really incredible story of recovering from a whole host of conditions, leaky gut, fibromyalgia, and other autoimmune conditions. She'll be talking about plant-based nutrition and the important role of lifestyle for her recovery. And so we hope that you can join us for that. Go to lifestylemed.org/online to sign up and get the Zoom link. And please do share it with your friends and family as well who you think could benefit. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, so much.
All right, pleasure.
Yes. And thank you to those on Facebook for watching. Thank you.